Very excited to have the opportunity to introduce a concept behind what, yes, Angela says will be our next workshop, the title of which will be A Year Without a Winter. And I'm speaking also on behalf of my co-principal investigator, Cynthia Celine, who I understand many of you know. And so we're both based at the School for the Future of Innovation in Society at Arizona State, but we're working on this project at multiple locations worldwide because it's necessarily a collaborative and transdisciplinary project. Can you hear me? Okay, so this, happily, after lunch, we can start on a rather casual note with a story. It's a story that probably a lot of you know or know parts of, and it begins here at the Villa Diodati, which is was the residence of Lord Byron in the early 19th century. So the story concerns the origin of the novel Frankenstein, which of course has an undue influence on science policy and continues 200 years later to permeate the way that we think about fish, water quality, etc. That Franken can be appended to anything. So, as you may know, this novel came into existence during the cold and unseasonal summer of 1816, a summer that came to be known as the Year Without a Summer. And this was the year that Lord Byron was vacationing with Percy Shelley, then Mary Godwin, and two of their companions, Claire Clairmont and John Polidori. And as they were kept inside at this lovely mansion by incessant rains and thunderstorms, squabbling, and apparently taking some very intoxicating and stimulating substances, they came across a collection of ghost stories, which they entertained themselves by reading. And this gave rise to a competition among this aspiring group of English literati that became known as the Dare. And in the introduction to the novel Frankenstein, Mary Shelley, who would marry Percy Shelley a couple of years later, describes how she was inspired to write this story, this waking dream that she has of a monster peering into her window as she listens to these claps of thunder. And in the introduction to this novel, we hear a kind of resonance of the importance of this kind of horrific atmosphere in shaking Shelley's consciousness and maybe opening up her imagination to what will become this incredibly influential story. So in one of the early letters that introduces Dr. Frankenstein as he's going to tell his story to Roger Merton, who's exploring the Arctic, Frankenstein says to Merton, "Prepare to hear of occurrences that are usually deemed marvelous. Were we among the tamer scenes of nature, I might fear to encounter your unbelief, perhaps your ridicule, but many things would appear possible in these wild and mysterious regions that would provoke laughter, the laughter of those unacquainted with the ever-varied powers of nature." So this story became an inspiration for me in the context of the Frankenstein bicentennial celebrations that are planned at ASU for 2018. And it was in a conversation with David Gustin, who I understand is also part of the conversation here in absentia. We happened to be discussing an article by Jack Stiglo called Public Engagement of Biotechnologies Offers Lessons for Governance of Geoengineering Research and Beyond, which happens to start with the story, again, of Frankenstein. Because the unknown part of this story was that the reason that it was so cold and inclement in the summer of 1816, something that would only come to be known 100 years later, was that on April 15th, 1815, one of the largest volcanic eruptions in human history in about the last 10,000 years happened on the island of Sumbawa in Indonesia. It took about a year for these cloud of dust and sulfates to spread around the world and cause this incredible cooling effect, which actually lasted for 3 years. And with such understated irony, I found this suggestive passage in Jack's article. Such climatic disruption has inspired scientific as well as literary insight. And we're probably all overly familiar with the scientific insight that was inspired by volcanic eruption, because now we're confronting and debating the possibility of stratospheric injection. In other words, of copying, just as Dr. Frankenstein mimics the idea that life can be created through a bolt of lightning, we now have the idea that we can cool our rapidly warming planet by mimicking the effects of a volcanic eruption. So in this context, we proposed at ASU to undertake a new project, which takes as its starting point the idea that we now face a new climate crisis, not in the form of global cooling, but of course in the form of climate change, or previously known as global warming. And with that in mind, we wanted to ask what kind of stories, images, and research questions might A Year Without a Winter inspire? So A Year Without a Winter is a project that it actually began as a project to restage the DARE, restage the story competition, and perhaps expand it to an artistic competition that would lead to an exhibition and a literary anthology published in 2018 on the bicentennial anniversary of Frankenstein. But as we started thinking through the kind of curatorial research that would go into such an art exhibition and the kind of preparation that we might want to make in order to expose artists and writers to some of the scientific information about climate change, as we started to think our way into what A Year Without a Winter might be, what it might mean, it rapidly unfolded into a huge research project that very often feels like a Frankenstein-like monster chasing me around the world. With questions like, well, what really is climate? A question that turns out to be difficult to answer even if you're a climate scientist. How do people imagine and comprehend climate change? How do we anticipate possible futures? Through models, through novels, through films, through desires and fears. What can and should be done about climate change? Should we intervene? Should we radically change our lifestyles, et cetera? And how does climate change manifest locally? And of course, a part of that question is, what would A Year Without a Winter mean at various locations, including locations that actually don't have a climatological winter? There's not actual variation. Does A Year Without a Winter have a meaning, like climate change, at a global scale, or does it only have meaning at a local scale? And so these are questions that we're taking up through a variety of media, including art exhibitions that will happen between, actually they begin this spring, but they'll happen between now and 2018 in Phoenix, Copenhagen, Berlin, Jakarta, and possibly Antarctica, where there's a Antarctica Biennale being planned, but this is a somewhat speculative art exhibition. But also we felt that it was important to return in association, in geographical association, to Indonesia as being the source of this cloud. Indonesia is one among many, but is one source of emissions that are now driving climate change. Also in the form of workshops. We recently led a workshop at ASU called Planetary Design, Climate 3.0, where we took up some of these ethical questions around geoengineering, restaging the literary DARE, and I'm looking forward to seeing how we might elaborate this collective thought experiment at the JRC next fall. So just in closing, I'll mention that this scenario, this effort to imagine what A Year Without a Winter would mean is something that generates a vast range of research questions. And it's certainly beyond the scope of my expertise as a philosopher. But I very much encourage participation and would welcome especially people interested in exploring the economic, phenological, security, and health consequences of this question. You can follow developments of this project at ayearwithoutawinter.org, and I might be able to explain to you what some of these imagery means in pertaining to this question. So thank you.